You are not a violent person. You have never hurt anyone. You go about your life, follow the rules, treat people decently, and you sleep at night without guilt. You are, by every measure you can think of, a good person. And that is exactly what every single person in the experiment thought about themselves, right up until the moment they weren't. The question that has haunted psychologists for over a century is not what makes a killer. It is something far more disturbing. The question is what separates a killer from you. And the answer that decades of research keeps returning to is not what you want to hear. It is not character. It is not morality. It is not upbringing or genetics or some dark defect in the soul. The answer is a situation. One situation. The right situation. And under it, the research suggests, almost anyone becomes capable of almost anything. That is not a theory. That is what the data shows. And the data is impossible to look away from. In 1961, a psychologist named Stanley Milgram set up what looked like a simple memory experiment at Yale University. Participants were told they were helping to study the effects of punishment on learning. They sat in front of a machine, a shock generator with switches labeled from 15 volts up to 450 volts. At the highest end, a label read simply XXX. On the other side of a wall, connected by a microphone, was a learner, someone who would receive a shock every time they got an answer wrong. The learner was an actor. The shocks were not real, but the participants did not know that. What Milgram wanted to know was simple. How far would an ordinary person go if an authority figure, in this case, a researcher in a white lab coat, told them to keep going? At what point would decency win? At what point would a normal human being look at the machine, look at the person in authority, and say no? The results destroyed every prediction. Before the experiment ran, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, graduate students, and ordinary people about what they expected. Almost everyone said that no more than 1 to 3% of participants would go all the way to 450 volts. They were certain. Of course, ordinary people would stop. Of course, basic human decency would intervene. 65% of participants administered the maximum shock. Every single participant went past 300 volts. Many of them were visibly distressed, sweating, trembling, laughing nervously, begging the researcher to let them stop. And then, when the researcher said simply, "Please continue," they continued. The experiment has been replicated in over 20 countries. The results hold. Across cultures, across decades, across different versions of the setup, ordinary people keep going further than anyone predicted they would. Milgram spent the rest of his career trying to understand why. What he found was that it was not cruelty that drove compliance. It was the situation, the presence of a legitimate authority figure, the gradual escalation, each shock only slightly higher than the last, the physical distance from the person being harmed, the framing of the action as part of a scientific, legitimate, important task. Remove any one of these elements and compliance drops dramatically. Keep them all in place and ordinary people do extraordinary harm. He called it the agentic state. The idea that under certain conditions, a person stops experiencing themselves as a moral agent, a free individual responsible for their own choices, and begins to experience themselves as an instrument of someone else's will. They are not choosing to hurt. They are following instructions. And the moral weight of the act transfers, in their mind, to the person giving the orders. You have felt a version of this. Every time you did something at work that made you uncomfortable, because a manager asked you to. Every time you went along with a group decision you privately disagreed with. Every time you followed a rule without questioning whether it was right. The agentic state is not extraordinary. It is something your brain slips into more easily than you think. But Milgram's work was only the beginning. Philip Zimbardo, a psychologist at Stanford University, wanted to know what happened when you gave ordinary people not just instructions, but power. In 1971, he ran what became one of the most infamous experiments in the history of psychology. He took 24 healthy, psychologically normal male college students and randomly assigned half of them to be guards and half to be prisoners in a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford's psychology building. The experiment was supposed to run for 2 weeks. It had to be shut down after 6 days. Within hours, the guards began to abuse their power. They woke prisoners in the middle of the night for arbitrary roll calls. They forced them into degrading exercises. They took away basic privileges for no reason. They began to psychologically torment the prisoners in ways that became increasingly creative and cruel. And crucially, they had not been told to do any of this. They had simply been given the role of guard. The situation did the rest. Zimbardo himself became so absorbed in the role of prison superintendent that he lost his own perspective as a researcher. It was his then-girlfriend, psychologist Christina Maslach, who visited the experiment on its 5th day, looked at what was happening, and told him it had to stop. She was the only outside observer out of 50 who raised an objection. 50 people watched. 1 objected. Zimbardo spent decades after the Stanford Prison Experiment studying what he came to call the Lucifer effect, the process by which good people are transformed into agents of harm, not through corruption of character, but through the corrupting power of situation and system. His conclusion, laid out in his 2007 book, was not comforting. He argued that the line between good and evil is permeable, that almost any person, placed in the right situation with the right pressures and the right justifications, can cross it, and that the most dangerous belief a person can hold is the belief that they are immune. The research of Hannah Arendt adds another layer to this. Arendt, a philosopher and political theorist, covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the Holocaust, in 1961. She expected to encounter a monster. What she found was something far more disturbing. Eichmann was ordinary, bureaucratic. He spoke in cliches. He did not hate the people he had helped to kill. He had simply, as she put it, never thought about it. He had followed orders, processed paperwork, managed logistics, and never paused to consider the moral reality of what the system he served was doing. She called it the banality of evil, the idea that the greatest atrocities in human history were not carried out by monsters. They were carried out by people who stopped thinking, people who handed their moral agency to a system, to an authority, to a role, and simply executed their function without examining it. This is not history. This is a description of a cognitive tendency that lives in you right now, the tendency to defer, to comply, to assume that the system knows better, to follow the procedure even when something feels wrong, to let the role you are playing determine the actions you take. The research is not saying you are a killer. It is saying something more precise and more unsettling than that. It is saying that between you and the worst things a human being can do, the distance is not character. It is not morality. It is not some fundamental difference in who you are at your core. The distance is a situation, a specific set of pressures, authorities, justifications, and gradual escalations. And those situations are not rare. They are constructed around you constantly, in workplaces, in institutions, in political systems, in social groups. The one thing that every piece of research on this topic agrees on is what breaks the effect. It is not bravery. It is not exceptional moral character. It is awareness. The moment a person recognizes the mechanism, the authority, the escalation, the agentic state, the role, the spell weakens. Milgram found that when participants could see another person refuse to comply, their own compliance dropped dramatically. Zimbardo found that the guards who resisted cruelty were the ones who maintained a sense of themselves as individuals, rather than surrendering to the role. You are a good person. You believe that, and you are probably right. But the research asks you to hold that belief alongside another one. The belief that goodness is not a fixed property. It is not something you have and keep forever regardless of circumstances. It is something you maintain, actively, by staying aware of the situations that are designed to erode it, by noticing when you have slipped into the agentic state, by being the person in the room who asks the question nobody else is asking. You are not a killer, but the difference between you and one is not as wide as you want it to be. And knowing that, really knowing it, is the only thing that keeps it that way.